Hey, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the One Step Better podcast. Today, we have a special edition, a little bit different than normal. I have a good friend, Randy Allred, who's going to be joining us and talking about all things insurance. What we find is that insurance for a lot of people can be a bit of a fuzzy subject. Do I have enough coverage? Do I have the right coverage? Should I have additional coverage? And so Randy and I hash all of that out during today's episode. So make sure you listen in, take a bunch of notes. It'll be really good. Thanks. This is the One Step Better podcast. Helping small businesses make wins each and every week. So Randy, I've been doing this whole insurance thing for about, a couple years now. And as I got into it, what I quickly realized is that the more I don't know is coming up all the time. I find that a lot of times people are afraid to talk about insurance. They're not super savvy on what they have, what coverages they have, what coverages they don't have, what they even should have. What's been your experience with working with small business owners as it relates to their insurance needs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of small business owners are pulled in so many different directions, right? Running the business, keeping it operational, keeping it profitable, that insurance is oftentimes one of the things they forget to even think about. And especially as their businesses start to grow and evolve, most businesses will start out, right, with probably lower limits, and they never go back and review those policies. They never go back and look at them. They never things don't change from when a policy was originally started with a small business. 5 years, 10 years down the road, their limits and exposures are probably a lot greater than when they started. People just don't know what's in the policy. And there's a lot of foreign language in there to a lot of people. And so even if I would say the rare person that actually reads their insurance policy probably has no idea what's even in their policy. Yeah. And if they do, they can't understand it.
Or they assume everything's covered.
Yeah.
I have insurance, therefore, if anything under the sun happens, I'm going to be covered.
Yeah.
That's not always the case.
Ton of loopholes. Yeah. Sometimes I think these insurance carriers look for opportunities to not pay, right? And they actually write it into the policy. But I would willing to venture and bet that most people have never even looked at their insurance policy outside of a declarations page and the signature acceptance page.
With that being true, because I would agree wholly with that. If that's true, what's the role of the carrier versus the broker versus the business owner to actually know what's in their stuff? Because if I'm not an insurance expert and I'm expecting the guy that I'm buying this insurance plan from to be an expert. Sure. If I read the thing, I still don't even know what it says.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it really falls on that business owner, right? To know what's in their policy. When they sign that form, they're basically acknowledging, and I mean, if you read the fine print on most signature acceptance forms, that I'm agreeing to and accepting the coverage that's outlined in this proposal. And so ultimately the burden does fall back on the business owner, right? To know what's in their policy. So if there's a gap or something there, now hopefully that's why you're hiring the right broker and not just any broker off the street. Because hopefully your broker, you're hiring them to be an expert in their industry, to know what they're doing and know they know your business and they know those gaps and they're providing the right coverage to fill those gaps. But the ultimate end decision maker is the business owner to say, do I have the coverage and does it meet my risk tolerance? And so just asking really good questions, engage with your broker. I feel like insurance oftentimes is a very transactional relationship, right? Where a business owner will call and say, hey, I need a general liability policy or a work comp policy. They ask some basic questions, generate a quote, flip it out, signed, and that's the end of it.
Here's kind of your canned policy.
Correct.
We're good, right? Yeah.
But really, a good business owner and broker should sit down and have an in-depth conversation of the operations of the business, what those exposures are. If there's anything that's above and beyond that kind of cookie cutter policy, that most businesses do have extra needs and need extra coverage, and it's not expensive to buy. Oftentimes, they're just unaware.
Yeah. We often say, as an accounting firm, a lot of business owners are afraid to admit or acknowledge that they don't exactly understand what a financial statement is or should be doing or what it looks like or what's good or bad about it. I find insurance is similar.
I agree.
Because there's a pride, there's an ego that comes in with being a business owner, especially if you're successful. Yeah, I built this thing, and so I got to know something. And it's hard to admit that, you know what, insurance is a critical part of something I need. I don't think anybody likes to pay for insurance, but it is critical, and you got to have it. But I also don't want to admit that I don't necessarily know exactly what's in my policy.
Yeah.
I don't want to admit that, you know what, if maybe a tornado came through and took my building out, I think that's covered, but I'm not 100% certain or what the limit of my coverage is.
I think you're spot on. Yeah. I mean, there is an element of pride that we just have to overcome, right? And be willing to partner and know that you've hired the best broker that's looking out for your needs. And man, I can't emphasize enough the fact that you need to ask quality questions, right? And have a good dialogue with your broker, because they really should be your advocate, right? Looking out for you and finding those extra needs and getting those coverages placed. And so maybe the business owner doesn't really need to know it if they have a great broker.
Yeah.
But I would still...
We got to have an understanding on some level.
I would hope so.
You would hope so. So if you're sitting down in front of a small business owner and you're reviewing coverage, thinking about, these are all the different options that you need, what are some of the questions that you're asking them? What are some of the things that you need to learn to figure out what's the best policy?
Yeah, gosh, that's a really good question, and I think it could go a lot of different directions based off of, I think one of an area right now that we're seeing claims happen at a large pace or scale is employment practices, right? And when you think of that, think of discrimination or racism and kind of what's happening in our world, right? And the sensitivity and exposure to this type of situation in the workplace. A lot of people have no coverage for that. And it's not necessarily for discrimination or harassment outside of the organization, but it's internally. Think of maybe a small restaurant owner who has managers working, the afternoon shift, evening shift, and maybe the business owner isn't there kind of managing and being hands-on. What is that manager saying and doing? How are they interacting? Are they discriminating against a certain class of people? And if so, that's a huge exposure that you may not even have. And so I think it's just really understanding the operations of the business. A good broker hopefully is asking those questions. And a business owner, I think, as they meet and consult with these insurance advisors and brokers, is to really be an open book, share all the ins and outs of the businesses. As a broker, we should know what those coverages look like, right? And what those gaps are by looking at maybe an existing policy. But I think most of the times, I would even look at a cyber policy as being really critical in today's world. There's cyber hacks that happen all the time. What type of coverage do we even have in a cyber policy? Things we may not have thought through before. If you're collecting data, personal information, and that gets leaked, whose responsibility is that? Oftentimes people say, well, I have a merchant account through Google or Square or whoever, right?
Go after Amazon.
Right. Yeah. Good luck. That's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
If you read through the fine print on those contracts with those companies, it ultimately ends back on you as the business owner. So it's really just understanding the nuances of the business and the operations, and then making sure there's a good dialogue between business owner and broker to make sure those coverages or those needs are covered.
Cyber is the big one that I think is pretty scary for a lot of people, especially in our world where we're dealing a lot with computers, technology. Our clients are doing the same, and that's how they interact with us. And it seems like that landscape in the insurance world has changed dramatically over the past few years even.
Yeah.
I think that our cyber policy was just maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was $5,000 a year. And then at our last renewal, it was this is going to be $20,000 a year. It was something insane. And you start talking to other people that have like-kind businesses, and it was, that seems like the norm now.
Yeah.
What's going on in that world?
Well, I mean, you think about it, just insurance in general, right? I have a kind of a saying that the carriers probably don't love, but the insurance carriers never lose, right? And so as claims go up, right, and along with cyber, EPLI would be in the same group. It was fairly cheap a couple years ago, but as we have these social movements and bringing more awareness to it, the burden of proof is back on the employer to prove that it didn't happen or that we have the right coverage. as claims occur and insurance carriers pay out these massive nuclear type of claims because there's just astronomical numbers associated with them, the rates go up for everyone, right? Who's buying from that particular carrier. And I think cyber is the same way because these cyber hacks are happening on a daily basis. It used to be they were going after the big retail shops like Target and Walmart, and these cyber attackers were going for a big payday. Well, they've actually found out that there's probably more money in it to go after the small guy because they pay, right? And they'll pay the ransom, and they don't likely have an insurance policy they have to go through, so they're just going to get it done and pay for it. Sometimes hopefully we do have the policy and there's coverage there, but that's why you're seeing the premium skyrocket because claims are being paid. It is happening on a more frequent basis with the small employer because we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have all the protection and the security that a Walmart or a Target has. We're just more vulnerable.
Not in the budget.
Yeah, we don't have the pockets for it. So, you will see more claims in that arena, and unfortunately, the premiums will likely continue to go up.
So what are the baseline coverages? What's the lines of coverages that you think every business owner needs, like at a bare minimum?
Right, work comp is the obvious one. It's kind of mandated by most states. So if you don't have a work comp policy, you're probably in violation of a law. And I think if you look at it, there's two types of coverages that are required by law. And so we'll start there, right? So work comp is one of them. And the other one is if you have a vehicle, you have to have auto insurance. So those are two that are just absolutely required. Now, the other ones I would argue may not be required by law, but you should have them, right? And so that's your general liability. I would argue in today's world and environment, EPLI is an absolute must. Cyber, a lot of people are still kind of taking a risk on those.
It kind of depends on the business. Like if I'm a restaurant, cyber may not be as big of a deal than if I'm a law firm.
Sure. Yeah. And I think depending on how you're collecting credit card information, right? Oftentimes we don't think of credit card information as personal information that's being collected, but are you storing and you keeping like registers of payments that are processed, names, addresses on those credit cards? Any personal information that's leaked could be considered part of that cyber hack. And so
that's interesting. Yeah.
Kind of a even for restaurants, I think is a fairly critical policy to have now. Fairly inexpensive because the exposure isn't as large as it would be for an accounting firm, but still a potential risk. And so then the other one's property, right, is a really critical risk and not just the actual building location, but also the internal components like personal property for any business would be a really wise insurance to have, in my opinion. And those are kind of the basics. You can get into if you're running a gym or if you're working with youth. One that people often overlook is like the molestation or sexual abuse policies. Those are carved out often.
So those are oftentimes carved out of your normal PNC coverage. So you should get a rider for that or endorsement for that?
So it's typically a separate policy. It could be in some cases a rider to an existing policy, but usually it's very specific coverage that is kind of carved out and need specific coverage for that.
Is that as widely insured from like a carrier standpoint? Are there a lot of carriers that play in that game?
There's not, no. So it's a fairly niche market, right? That there's a few carriers that do it and they do it well and they write that on a pretty consistent basis, but it's not your main street coverage, right?
Yeah.
So it is a little more difficult to acquire.
And then on top, you start to get into like if it's maybe if they're by an ocean, you're talking different coverage because that's where you start to get a lot of stuff carved out around water. Yes. Or if you're 15 feet up, 15 feet below, that's where things start to get a bit wonky.
Yeah, I mean, there's always exceptions, right? Depending on the risk of the business. If you're hauling cargo across the ocean, right, bringing something in from China, inventory, who's covering that inventory? Is it your responsibility? Is it the shipping company's responsibility? And so, again, I think that's where it really comes down to every business is so unique, and it just needs to be a very open dialogue with your broker to understand the operations where if you're responsible for even, I have a client who they run a bakery, and they'll ship their products down via an 18-wheeler down to other states, and then on the way back, so they're not driving empty, they're hauling other people's cargo, right? Well, who's responsible for that? Is it on, the restaurant because it's their 18-wheeler, or do the other people have the coverage to cover inventory coming back across state lines?
So you bring up a good point there. If I'm a business, I can control my insurance. I can write those policies, or I can go with a broker to write those policies, and I can make sure that my coverage is in place, and I can do that, annually review that, or oftentimes look at that on an ongoing basis. But that's different than, or I don't have as much control is if I have maybe subcontractors or third parties that are working on my behalf. What are some best practices that you recommend business owners put in place to make sure that they're covered as it relates to their maybe independent contractors, those third-party vendors that they're working through?
So great question. I think it's really important whenever you're working with like a 1099 or a subcontractor, that you're listed on their policy as an additional insured. And with the work comp, to also include waivers of subrogation, which basically means that in the event of a claim, they're going to go after that subcontractor's policy first and not the general contractor or not the hiring party. Those 1099s or subcontractors, you can actually request that, right? And I would request a certificate of insurance showing that I'm listed, my business is listed as the additional insured, or as that I have the waiver of subrogation listed on those policies for anyone that comes on my job. And oftentimes with work comp, it's an interesting dynamic, because if I'm the hiring party, and we'll use the construction industry as a good example here. If I'm a general contractor and I hire a subcontractor to come on my job, and I don't check to see if they have a certificate of insurance for work comp, and maybe they're flying rogue. Maybe it's a small artisan contractor coming on doing some HVAC work for me or something. If they have an injury on the job and they don't have work comp insurance, it's now my responsibility to pick up the claim on my policy. And in addition to picking up the injury, at the time of an audit, I'm also going to have to end up paying the premium for the amount of money that I paid that contractor while they were on my job. And so it's kind of a really fine line. Just assume that if you're the hiring party, you're likely assuming their risk if they don't have insurance. And so that's why you want to mitigate that risk as much as possible through being listed as additional insureds with waivers of subrogation, and then also
the waiver of subrogation, is that on your policy or is that on their policy?
That's on their policy. Yep. Basically saying they're
they're
waiving their
the
right
hiring
just to
party,
sue you. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do you go about getting on as another named insured on somebody else's policy?
It's actually a fairly easy process. So for example, if we were doing work together and you wanted to be listed on my policy as an additional insured, you would just simply submit that request to me. As a broker, you can add endorsements to the policy to add those additional insureds. Landlords oftentimes will do that, right? Hey, I'm leasing my property, I want to be listed as additional insured in the event of a claim that, and even so that they're paid out first on a claim, right? Mm-hmm. There oftentimes is a cost associated with adding additional insureds. Most carriers are pretty good about adding what they call a blanket endorsement, right? So that you can add as many additional insureds as you want. It's a fixed fee oftentimes, and it's a lot more cost effective to do it that way versus than adding them individually one at a time.
It's a pretty negligible
add-on,
right?
Depending on the carrier, I think you'd be safe to say or assume a range of anywhere from $750 to $200 for a blanket endorsement. Yeah. Think of it more of the cost of if you were to add 3 individual additional insureds, it's probably cheaper at that point to start adding the blanket instead of
and that's
one by
annually.
one. It is annually. Yeah.
And so if you're in the construction industry and you're doing a lot of work with GCs, that's probably a standard thing in your world because you're going to be working with a lot of different GCs that possibly want that.
So it's a standard practice for us. We add the additional insured almost unless we're advised not to, right? Because most subcontractors are going to be asked to list those general contractors or anyone they're doing work for to be an additional insured on the policy. So we almost add the blanket every time. There are some who say, I don't need it, I don't want it, and we'll save the $750, but that's probably the exception more than the rule.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So that's more on the covering business owner company, PNC, that side of things. What's been your experience in the marketplace, especially now that labor is a lot tighter, trying to find the right people for the right job is more difficult, especially depending upon industry, as it relates to group benefits? Is that becoming more and more of table stakes to get any type of talent? Or is it still just kind of out there where you see some people that are wanting to do it and others that aren't?
That's always been a really interesting question to me because, we'll use my own business, for example. I've had employees leave because they claim they're getting paid a dollar or two more to go work down the street for a different shop. And we've lost people because of that. And so we offer a very generous and rich benefits package at our business. And obviously we're in the industry, so I feel like it's part of what we have to do anyway. But we have fairly low deductibles, and as an organization, we pay 95% of all of our employee benefits for our employees, and then we cover a large portion of the family's benefit. And so there isn't a lot of cost to them. And if an employee's looked at that the right way, right, and they understand the true cost of those benefits that we're giving to them, this employee who left, he actually wanted to come back after he left because he thought he was leaving for more money. But then when he looked at the actual true cost of his insurance and how much we were contributing towards his insurance, he was actually taking a pay cut to leave. He didn't realize that at the time, and we parted ways and we're friends, but we didn't actually bring him back in. And so where talent is at a premium, what are you doing to attract talent, right? Is it just about the pay? Sometimes for some employees it is. For others, it's knowing that they have a great benefits package. And I think the more an employer can emphasize that and talk about it, we oftentimes call it the hidden paycheck. And if you can show them either annually or quarterly, here's what we contributed on behalf of your benefits, right? So you can have health insurance. It goes a long way, right? Just to saying, wow.
Those things start to matter.
Yeah, it adds up really quick. Because if you're not paying it, someone else is. And so if business owners are having a hard time attracting talent, look at your benefits package. It's a great way to bring people in. And oftentimes when we think of employee benefits, the number one, right, is health insurance that everybody thinks of. And there's a lot of focus on that with the Affordable Care Act. And that's a critical one. That's the one that's probably the highest cost is at the forefront. But oftentimes people will offer dental plans, and even by just offering a dental plan, you may not even contribute to it as an employer. But just by offering a group plan at a discounted rate for the employees can be enough.
Yeah.
Vision is the same way. There's a new space out there that's pet insurance, very low cost. And you
guys offer pet insurance, right?
We do, yeah. And you'd be amazed at how many people buy it.
What does pet insurance cover?
So think of it like health insurance for your animal, right? For your pet.
It's like routine visits at discounted rates.
Yeah, like a physical, if you will, and then if they have to go in for a surgery, then it's a discounted rate. And there's variations to the plans, but think of it as a health insurance type of policy for your animals.
That's so funny.
But I mean, as we look at our society, and people, our pets are part of our families, and they go on vacations with us, and so, and if we have a little golden doodle at our house, and if something happened to that, our dog, my kids would be devastated. I'd be devastated. My wife would be devastated. But if she has to go in for surgery, I mean, it's as much a surgery for you and I.
No kidding.
So I mean, who has an extra $10,000 laying around, especially if they're working a minimum wage type of position, but their animals are very important to them? That's a great benefit to know, hey, I got this taken care of. I don't have to worry about it. Maybe I pay $1,000 deductible, but I have the other $9,000 covered for my dog's broken leg or something. So it can be a game changer, and the cost is very low for the business owner as a throw-in coverage, right? Group life insurance is another one of those that's very inexpensive, especially if you do like the employer-sponsored plan versus a voluntary plan. A voluntary plan basically means the employee can choose to go on it or not. And if employer pays a large portion of it or pays that entire premium, it's a guaranteed issue of maybe $20,000 or $50,000 in the event of a death. And we're talking.
Those are super cheap.
Yeah, I mean, very, very inexpensive. A couple dollars maybe per employee for the monthly premium.
Yeah. So philosophically, I got a question for you. Um, voluntary life has always been one that I have a hard time with because on some side, like some part of me is, I want to encourage my team members to go get term life on their own,
Sure.
apart from employer sponsor, because it's you don't have to worry about portability issues. It's typically going to be cheaper. You're typically going to get better terms. How do you balance that? Like, you know what, I can't offer that plan. You're going to pay for it here. You're going to pay for it on the open market. Whereas it may be better to do it there versus here. How do you balance? This is a benefit that we're offering, but maybe it's not the best benefit that you could participate in as the employee.
So, I think it depends on the audience, right, and the employee. I agree. Everyone should have some type of life policy. Preferably, I carry a term and I have a whole life policy for myself. I'm in the insurance industry, so I see the value. And I think my business partners have the same setup, right? But not everybody can afford an extra $100 a month. Right now, gasoline's at an all-time high, right? That's some of the extras that people may need to cut out of their life that they just can't afford. But what happens in the event of a critical life event, right? Well, for the employer to give them a $50,000 guaranteed coverage, regardless of what your health history is, right? Oftentimes when you and I go to buy a term policy or whole life policy, there's medical underwriting that goes into it. We offer, as an employer, a guaranteed issue, regardless of your health status, $50,000 life or $100,000 or $250,000. Right, and obviously the premiums go up a little bit with each increase, but that is a really awesome benefit, especially in today's world where inflation's at an all-time high and everything's costing more than it ever has. I'll bet you, and I don't know the numbers on this, I'm just guessing, but I'll bet you life insurance and those extra nice-to-have things, people aren't doing as much. They're probably canceling their policies and saving that $50, $100 a month. And as an employer, if your cost goes up by $2 or $3 to give them some type of coverage, maybe they're sleeping a little bit better at night, and I think creating some loyalty to your organization. So those are the extra policies that I think people often overlook, and they think they're expensive, but man, it's going to be far less expensive than any of the other benefits you offer, and I think really helps retain employees.
Yeah. So the voluntary life is always kind of the standard one that a lot of people will go to. I feel like go to after medical, dental, vision. And then you get into the STDs, LTDs, short-term disability, long-term disabilities. Do you write a lot of that stuff? Are you still seeing that stuff happen a lot?
So, we do. We write it. We offer it. And again, depending on your industry, there could be some strategy to offering it or to not offering it, right? Say, for example, if they know they can get on a short-term disability plan, right, versus coming back to work, will they take that option?
Yeah.
Right. And so I think every situation is unique. We certainly talk through that with our clients. Would you benefit from having a short-term disability, or would it be a detriment to your business, right? Would you have people trying to get on that plan just to take compensation for a few weeks and then come back to work at that point? So I think it's case-by-case scenario. We still sell those. Typically, it's your same life and group life insurance companies that will offer long-term, short-term disability type of plans. But I'll bet of our kind of book of business, 60% offer long-term and short-term disability. It's fairly inexpensive.
Yeah. Similar
to that group life, right? You're thinking of similar premiums, maybe a couple dollars, at least in our market.
Yeah.
And that will vary by market, right? California, New York, Florida, probably higher than what it would be for.
It's going to be interesting to see how that stuff goes because, there's, I think, 13 states now that offer or they have a mandatory paid sick leave that is somewhat mimicking some of these STD policies that are out there.
Yeah.
I think in New York, I want to say, you don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 12 weeks of paid sick leave at 2/3, which is, you start to hear the language of these policies like, oh, those mandatory things. It's like, that sounds like a short-term disability policy.
It does, yeah.
And it's going to be interesting to see how that changes, both, what PTO looks like for employers now that things become mandatory and how that's going to affect insurance offerings over time. So,
definitely.
I'm curious, you mentioned, you guys have the pet policy. You guys offer full benefits for your team. Do you guys ever show like total comp packages to your team where it's both cash and non-cash compensation to see total benefit? Do you guys do that?
We try to. We could probably be better at that. I certainly think that there's a lot of value there because, again, it's the hidden paycheck that no one ever sees, right? I mean, I gave that example earlier of our employee leaving because he thought he was making $1 or $2 more, but then when he looked at his total comp, he was actually taking a huge decrease by leaving our organization because of the extra cost of health insurance. I think the place that he ended up going to only paid 50% of his individual premium and nothing for the family. Well, we were paying 95% of his and at least 50% of the family, depending on how long he's been with the organization. So it was a huge cut in pay for him. And I think it took an experience like that for us to kind of start showing more of those hidden paychecks, right? And so we certainly do it at least once a year at open enrollment. Unfortunately, that's a short-term memory with that, right? And so I think if an employer can do like an extra pay stub quarterly to say, hey, just so you know how great we are and how much we value, here's what we've contributed to you guys on a quarterly basis, right? Here's what we do. And just so it stays top of mind. Because if you're not doing that, if you're not remembering to do it, the employee is definitely not thinking about it. And so do they ever really understand what you're contributing?
Yeah, we haven't gone the route of showing total comp statements with our team. I have started to do that in our offer letters for new hires just because of that very reason. Like cash is one thing, but there's a lot of other stuff that you get as part of working here from a benefit standpoint. We do have, like on our pay stubs, it'll show employer paid items and stuff, medical, dental, vision, retirement. But we've never gone that extra step of doing like an annual, hey, this is where we're at, or things like that. I've been intrigued by that though.
I think it's a good practice for people to get into. All right, I mean, and we do the same thing. We show it on the pay stubs every payroll cycle, every 2 weeks. But how many of those employees are actually looking at that, right? I mean, I would argue if I pulled data, and I'm kind of a payroll nerd, so I get it. But if I looked at how many people actually opened the system and viewed their pay stubs, I'll bet you it's less than 10%. They go and they look at their bank account, I got paid, and they're never even seeing the employer paid portion, right? And it's there. So that's why we make it a very purposeful event where we actually hand deliver those envelopes, and we'll give them, hey, here is your hidden paycheck. Here's the extra stuff that we're contributing on your behalf quarterly or annually. And so it's kind of an event, right? And people see it, and I think when they get that, they really understand it. They appreciate it.
It's another touch point of positivity that you get to have with your employee.
Sure.
Of even if they value it or they don't value it, it is, I'm making an effort to show you, not only show you, but also do things for you that are valuable. And even if it's not valuable to you, it's valuable to somebody in your life, because these are true important things that you need to be thinking about or worried about or concerned about. And so,
agreed.
It's interesting. So, Randy, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day to come and talk to us about insurance. Wealth of knowledge. It's enjoyed to get to know you better. I really appreciate you, like I said, coming out and hanging out with us for a little bit.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the One Step Better podcast. I'd really appreciate it if you would take some time to rate us 5 stars on your podcast player of choice, and make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss out on another episode. Thanks, and have a great day.